You are feeling sleepy, very sleepy. When you wake up, you will go out and buy 10 copies of Love Me, Fierce and Danger, the Edgar-winning biography of James Ellroy by Stephen Powell. Hello, I hope my hypnotism scam has worked and you will go out and buy 10 copies of Love Me, Fierce and Danger. But in the meantime, we have a great book to cover on Ellroy Reads. This week's book is Heed the Thunder by Jim Thompson. Okay, so if you're unfamiliar with Ellroy Reads, this is a show where every week I look at a book that was highly influential to James Ellroy, a book that thrilled him, moved him, amused him. And this is a rather special episode because James Ellroy actually had a small role in the revival of Jim Thompson, both the critical and commercial revival in Jim Thompson's work in the 1990s. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about Jim Thompson himself. He had a wild life that was right out of one of his novels. He was born in 1906 in Anadarko in the Oklahoma Territory, and his father, known as Big Jim Thompson, was a teacher who married one of his students and later was elected sheriff of Caddo County. And Jim Thompson was actually born in an apartment above the county jail. Big Jim Thompson was accused of embezzlement and fled to Mexico on horseback. And the Thompson family moved around the states a lot, particularly the West. Nebraska, California. Big Jim Thompson comes back. He makes a fortune, loses a fortune in the oil industry in California. And our Jim Thompson begins a career as a writer. He'd done some pretty wild jobs before then. He was a bellboy at a hotel at the height of Prohibition and was making hundreds of dollars every week. This is like 1930s money in shifting contraband and alcohol and narcotics, and actually had a nervous breakdown at the age of 19. But when he turned to writing, he began to get some short stories published, and his early novels, and Heed the Thunder is only his second novel, were actually more kind of literary based than the success he would later go on for. This is a guy who had real ambitions to be one of the great literary figures of his day, and he kind of did, but become that, but not in the way we would expect, and that's just a writer's lot, I'm afraid. The best laid plans of mice and men Afghan Agley, especially with writers. It wouldn't be until he joined forces with Lion Books, who published crime fiction and pulp fiction, genre fiction, and was publishing a novel a year. They gave him free range, but they said, you've got to produce a novel a year. You can write on any subject you want, which was manna from heaven for him, so because he could write on the darkest subjects. And that's where his classic crime novels came in. Savage Night, The Killer Inside Me, The Getaway, A Swell-Looking Babe. He had an astonishingly good run for a while. He collaborated with Stanley Kubrick as a screenwriter on The Killing, which is based on the crime novel Clean Break, is one of the great film noirs. He also did work on Paths of Glory for him. They had plans for a third collaboration, but Kubrick got sidetracked with Spartacus, and it never came to be. By the 1960s, Thompson's alcoholism was beginning to affect his work, and he began to lose interest in the work, and his output slowed, and he began to disappear. By the early 70s, he was making something of a comeback because there was an interest in his work, although by which time he was, gravely ill. The Getaway was produced, and Thompson had a hand in the script, although he wasn't credited, and he took it to Writers Guild arbitration, and they ruled against him. That's a very famous film adaptation of The Getaway with Steve McQueen and Ally McGraw, who were the hottest couple at the time and the most famous couple in the world. The script was credited to Walter Hill, who's gone on to an amazing career as a director and screenwriter, and it was directed by Sam Peckinpah, who was at the peak of his powers before his alcoholism got the better of him. And although it kind of got minor reviews at the time, I thought is really held up as a classic film adaptation. The Thompson actually had a small acting role in the Farewell My Lovely remake with Robert Mitchum as Raymond Chandler, and then he sadly passed away in 1977 at the age of 70 after a series of strokes. And by the time he passed away, all of his work was out of print in the US, and he was yesterday's man, sadly. Although he had maintained a huge following in France, and the French have adapted a series of his novels. Pop 1280 was adapted as Coup de Torchon, Series Noire, um, and subsequently, and where we get to where Ellroy kind of comes into the story, is by the early 90s, Thompson was back in fashion again. And a lot of it had to do with films because Stephen Frears' film The Grifters was released based on Thompson's work. And that's considered one of the first films that really captured Thompson's writing. There was a series of subsequent films came out. The Kill Off, a remake of The Getaway, although I think that was kind of a scene for scene remake. It was very dull, really. If you've seen the original, it was dull. It's not bad. And then more recently, Michael Winterbottom directed a version of The Killer Inside Me, which is actually really good. That's the second time that's been adapted. His films have been adapted again and again. After Dark, My Sweet, This World, Then the Fireworks, which is not so good, but it's worth a look. But basically, there was probably about a dozen film adaptations, and they're all really, really interesting. And they all focus on Jim Thompson's heyday, which was the 1950s and the early 1960s, when he was producing really powerful crime writing and also kind of extremely concise, grotesque, and imbued with a sense of horror. So if anyone who reads today, say Val McDermid or Mo Hader, these writers who do these wonderful detective horror mashups, Jim Thompson really brought horror to the crime genre in a way that Chandler and Hammett didn't didn't dare. I would say. So Heed the Thunder, just to go back, was his second novel, and this was brought back into print by Otto Penzler at the beginning of the kind of 90s Thompson boom. And James Ellroy was well established by this time. He was already coming to completing the LA Quartet. So he was probably the biggest name in crime writing at the time, and he was asked to write the introduction to this book. He hadn't read any Thompson. It completely slipped under his radar, even during his formative years when he was reading Chandler, he was reading Hammett. And he says, okay, he reads the book, and he quite admires it, and he subsequently reads a lot more of Jim Thompson. So where this book comes in, it is a melodrama set in Nebraska, around about, say, 1914, the 1910s. So really, you've got kind of themes of the death of the West, the westward expansion, through the economic expansion, through the frontier. You've at the heart of it, you have this family, the Fargos, who have economic dominance over the area, but they're past their day. In fact, this is a kind of this is very much a transitional novel in that the automobile is arriving, and skimming through the reviews of this novel, they said that this is kind of a really twisted version of the Magnificent Ambersons. So we're seeing kind of the death of the Old West, and we're seeing the sins of the father really permeating through the generations. Now, it's easy to tie this to Thompson's real life father. In fact, patriarchs, somewhat demented and psychopathic patriarchs, were a theme in his work. In fact, Thompson's father was actually the model of the sheriff in The Killer Inside Me. In fact, this family there's so much kind of incest in this family, it's almost accidental incest, because the cousins in the family spread out through all of the kind of Nebraska, the little villages and the little towns. So it's really just impossible to get married without kind of intermingling the bloodlines that run through this. Plot-wise, it kind of drifts in and out. It's not. It's much more melodrama than crime fiction. In fact, what we really have is a series of episodes, some of which work and some of which don't. There is a wonderful scene early on where we have the itinerant preacher, who's this despicable character. He's really venal and exploiting people for money, and he's tarred and feathered and ridden out of town. And one of the people who does it is sheriff. I mean, incognito. And really, through the melodrama, we have a sense of horror, kind of impending horror, but also a sense that because this novel was not particularly successful for Thompson, it wasn't his breakout novel by any means. It's the early horror where Thompson would find his voice in his later classic novels like Pop 1280 and The Getaway and several more. Subsequently, Ellroy, after reading Heed the Thunder and quite liking it, he read classic Thompson. He read the 50s crime novels. And he wasn't entirely complimentary about them, although he did say, reading Jim Thompson's 50s, it feels like they were written for, say, $500 in a kind of 3-week period, which they were. And he's right, they were absolutely written for that. But even though he didn't attract highbrow critics during his lifetime, look at how crime fiction academics, not just critics, look at how they admire these novels now. And I think it's really an interesting economic situation that we could potentially go back to, because publishing is in crisis, it's always in crisis. And now AI is the latest crisis. That crime novels seem to be today, they seem to be very, very big, very thick. They're 400, 500 pages. That's the economic model. Those are the books that you'd see in Waterstones. And really, if you want to get people to pick up a novel, with dwindling attention spans, with social media pressures and everything, go back to those spinning supermarket racks and the really thin crime novels. This one isn't thin. He hadn't learned his lesson yet. But that concision and that genius of crime writing really came through in... Today, we'd say they were probably closer to novella length, although we define them as novels of the time. Ellroy became quite chummy with Robert Polito, who is Jim Thompson's biographer. His biography, Savage Art, of Thompson, is well worth reading and won the National Book Award. And they did a few readings together, and Polito was on the guest list for Ellroy's 50th birthday party. Although Ellroy was kind of coy about that, and Polito never, when I was writing Ellroy's biography, Polito never got back, although he'd been quite complimentary about my work. He'd written something supportive in favour of the work I was doing, but he didn't want to be drawn on his friendship with Ellroy. I mean, I don't know. I mean, who knows? I mean, Ellroy seemed like he went a bit cold on Jim Thompson after a while, but when you've read widely in the genre and you know authors, you begin to know authors inside out, you begin to know the flaws. I like to think that the viewers of this show will be new to some of these books, and will definitely be new to Heed the Thunder. Jim Thompson was the master. This is him finding his voice. It's an epic melodrama, and it features much of the horror, incest, murder, that would play so well in his crime fiction. And really, this is based in the 1910s West, and Ellroy's peak years is in his portrayals and his settings in his novels, is the 1940s Los Angeles. That's his West. I once asked him, is there any semblance of the Old West in your Los Angeles quartet? And he's like, well, not really, not depending on how far you go back. LA is a boom town, and it's the post-war boom on my peak years. This is before he started writing the second quartet, which is a wartime, which has a wartime setting. But even then, wartime economy for the US was unexpectedly a boom economy. It wasn't for Europe. Europe was completely devastated, but isolated from the battlefields, the US did quite well. So Yeah, there are the seeds of kind of Ellroy's LA in this depiction of the West. The definitely in the kind of and in the ethnic groups, the very waspy European, German, Swedish, I mean, British ethnic groups that are going through the West at the time. Very different from what you think of LA today, particularly Latin and other ethnic groups. Okay, thanks very much for watching. I hope you go out and buy Heed the Thunder by Jim Thompson. I hope you also buy don't forget your 10 copies of Love Me First in Danger with free merch. And I'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.